Salufalava, this is Pacific Waves from RNZ Pacific. I'm Susanna Swiswiki. Coming up,
it's a long way away, and there's still many outstanding issues with the rules and regs.
Kiribati explores deep-sea mining deal with China. Also, foreign aid will survive despite US freeze, and
they're herbivorous, and so if they're floating around on vegetation, they may even have a source of food to eat.
A new study looks at the origins of Fiji's iguanas. Kiribati is exploring a deep-sea mining deal with China after a breakdown in its agreement with mining frontrunner. The metals company no longer has 75,000 square kilometres in exploration rights of the high seas through Kiribati's state-owned company, Marawa Research and Exploration. Caleb Fotheringham has more.
Kiribati's Ministry of Fisheries and Ocean Resources held talks with China's ambassador to explore a potential collaboration, filling the gap left by the metals company. The company previously had 3 exploration contracts in international waters and is now down to 2. A spokesperson from the metals company in a statement says the termination of the contract was mutual. The statement has been voiced.
We concluded that nodule abundances on Marawa's ground were not prospective with current technology and sought to explore various paths forward.
Deep-sea mining hasn't started yet, and there are no rules to do so in international waters. Despite this, the metals company is planning to submit an application to mine in June by using a legal loophole. The company, along with several others, have also asked the ISA in a letter to get a move on with adopting mining rules, saying they have poured billions into exploring potential sites and have the expectation of extracting the valuable minerals. Part of the letter has been voiced.
We contractors have collectively invested approximately $2 billion in the exploration of deep-sea mineral resources, the acquisition of environmental and biodiversity baseline data, and the development of mining and processing technology.
Phil McGabe from the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition says mining rules will not be ready anytime soon.
It's a long way away, and there's still many outstanding issues with the rules and regs, and I think they're panicking. They're trying to put pressure on, and I think it's probably directed more at their own investors.
Environmental groups also claim the metals company is moving away from its original pitch that critical metals are essential for the green transition to one more geared towards security and defence. A press release in December from the metals company says it applauds the US defence feasibility study on deep-sea nodule refining. CEO Jared Barron told the US Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party in September last year his company, a Western company, is in the lead by about 5 years when it comes to deep-sea minerals.
I firmly believe that in order for the United States to outcompete China in the critical mineral space, we must invest in domestic capabilities to harvest and also refine seabed minerals.
Mr. McGabe is critical about the apparent shift.
The true character, true nature's coming out. They've moved away from deep-sea mining for the green transition and moved it towards critical minerals for security and defence.
The 30th session of the International Seabed Authority is currently meeting in Kingston, Jamaica to discuss deep-sea mining rules and regulations. It's under new leadership, and environmental groups hope the new Secretary General will prioritise the health of the seabed over industry concerns.
Despite the United States pulling the plug on foreign aid, the likelihood of other countries following this path, the impact of COVID-19 and the zest for a military build-up in the West, and academics says assistance from the wealthier countries to the poorer ones will still come. Robin Davies is an honorary professor at the Australian National University's Crawford School of Public Policy and has also worked with the Department of Foreign Affairs and for AusAid. He says the OECD consensus on aid has broken down, more than 60 years after it was developed by the US. Mr. Davies spoke with Don Wiseman.
Is this the end of foreign aid?
No, but it's going to put a massive dent in it. It's definitely a big shift in the balance between the sort of traditional OECD donor grouping and the rest of the world, the sort of emerging donors, obviously China, but also UAE and a lot of the other Arab states and smaller countries that are beginning to build up their aid programs. So yeah, it's a big shift in the balance, but there's always going to be some level of overseas aid for a range of reasons, a little bit, moral reasons, humanitarian reasons, but also there will always be diplomatic imperatives to continue providing certain forms of aid, especially bilateral aid to the neighbours of more developed countries to less developed countries. So yeah, I think what we're looking at is a massive adjustment, probably the biggest adjustment since aid began back in the 60s, but not exactly the end of it. We've seen a lot of headlines announcing the end of aid, and that's happened many times over the years, but it'll never completely end.
What makes you so certain that there'll still be bilateral aid and support for neighbours?
Well, if you look at the components of overseas aid at the moment, there's a number of layers. At the very heart, there's always humanitarian assistance, whether it's disaster relief or assistance to countries that are experiencing instability or outright conflict. That's always going to continue.
That's not going to come from the US.
I wouldn't assume that at all. So USAID is gone. The organisation USAID is effectively gone. It hasn't actually been abolished yet, but there's almost no question that it will be. But the US has always provided humanitarian assistance, not through USAID, but through the State Department. And whatever happens next, it looks likely that some small proportion of USAID's staff and functions will be merged into the State Department. And the State Department already owns what is called the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which has always provided the sort of humanitarian aid in response to disasters and conflicts. I think it's very unlikely that will not continue. Likewise, the US and other countries have always found it convenient to provide economic assistance to countries where they want those countries to remain stable and friendly. And that has flowed through, in the US's case, that has flowed through a range of agencies, whether it's through the Treasury or USAID or state, or even sometimes the Department of Agriculture and others. That sort of stuff is always going to continue where it serves the interests of donor countries, whether it's the US or any other country. And then there's another layer where a lot of donor countries have very active NGO communities. Those communities raise a lot of money from the public in donor countries, and there has always been a practice, a tradition of donor governments in some way matching those contributions from the public, whether it's providing tax deductibility or actively matching those contributions. And again, I think you're going to see that sort of thing continue. The question is how much of global aid is in those categories. It's a minority. It's always going to be, I wouldn't want to put a figure on it, but I'd say if you had to take a wild guess, at most it would be around a third of the amount of aid that is flowing currently.
I know that NGOs in New Zealand over the last few years have really been struggling to raise money, that there's been they sense a whole switch in terms of what the general public is prepared to do, and they're not giving the money to NGOs.
Correct. And the pandemic, it's not totally clear why, but the pandemic certainly led to a reduction in public support for international NGOs, that, people were feeling the pinch, the cost of living, and people were being perhaps more inclined to donate to domestic charities. Who knows what the reasons are, but we've certainly seen a reduction in Australia as well as New Zealand in public support for NGOs. It's hard to predict what will happen there, though, because if people who are charitably minded or committed to international development, if they see that there are really huge reductions across the world in government aid, it may change their view. It might incline them to increase their contributions to non-government organisations as a way of filling the gap and also registering a sort of protest against this, what they might perceive as a new stinginess in official aid policy.
What do you think the impact will be on, say, the Pacific nations?
So the Pacific is a little unusual in that it has a strong umbrella of protection from Australia in terms of aid, and it is not very reliant on assistance from other countries, including the US. The Pacific Island countries do not receive significant amounts of funding from the US. Their major donor by far is Australia. New Zealand is important, particularly in the realm countries, and then other donors are doing bits and pieces, often through regional institutions.
They are looking And they have been looking for the last several years for a significant step up so that they can combat climate change. That money hasn't been forthcoming. They're looking, I guess, to the US and to Europe for much of that. And that's not going to come at all now, is it?
Correct. So the US, as you would know, the Biden administration had in fact announced a significant step up of American assistance to the region for things like the regulation of fisheries and a range of other things, and for climate change related programs. But then the Biden administration lost office before any of that even began to be implemented. So compared to the trajectory that had been mapped out by the Biden administration, certainly these changes in the US mark a big difference. But compared to the amount of money that's currently actually flowing, it's not going to have a massive impact on the Pacific. I guess it disappoints the hopes of Pacific leaders based on what they had heard from the previous administration. But it's not like there's a whole lot of money flowing from the US that has suddenly gone missing now.
There's been a prediction, a number of predictions, I suppose, that this lessening of aid will be opening up the region to welcome in a lot more assistance from China.
Yeah, and we don't know what's going to happen there, but it's not automatically the case that China will expand its assistance to fill the space left by the US. You can look at it another way. I mean, the space has shrunk and China automatically occupies a bigger proportion of that space, and they might be quite content with that situation. They might be happy to wave goodbye to the US and the region without necessarily expanding their own aid. So we have to see how China plays that. But certainly it's likely that Pacific leaders will be more inclined to look toward China and ask the question, and we have to see what the answer will be.
A new study suggests Fiji's iguanas came from North America around 34 million years ago by floating some 8,000 kilometres. It's the longest known dispersal of any land animal. So how did they do it? NPR's Jonathan Lambert reports.
Scientists have two major theories to explain how iguanas ended up on the tropical island Fiji. Simon Scarpetta is a biologist at the University of San Francisco.
People had suggested that they must have taken some kind of raft of down vegetation from somewhere in the Americas all the way across the Pacific, through the doldrums of the equator, through the southern equatorial current, and then made their way to Fiji.
The other idea is that Fijian iguanas got there much more gradually. Over many generations, iguanas from the Americas might have walked or island hopped over land bridges that are now underwater. But biologists haven't had enough evidence to distinguish between these possibilities.
We didn't really know how the Fijian iguanas were related to other iguanas, and then we also didn't really know how old they were.
To figure that out, Scarpetta and his colleagues used genomic data to build a detailed family tree. The results, published in the journal PNAS, surprised him.
The iguanas that live on Fiji were most closely related to a group of iguanas that I knew very well from the United States, called desert iguanas.
Scarpetta estimates that these iguanas split a little over 30 million years ago, a timeline that doesn't quite line up with the land bridge idea. Instead, he thinks a small group of iguanas made one single trip from North America to Fiji. Similar, albeit shorter trips have been observed on tangles of downed trees in the Caribbean.
People saw in real time that green iguanas were able to get around 300 kilometers just floating on displaced vegetation from one island to the other. And so that was super cool.
Reaching Fiji would have been nearly 30 times as far. But if any creature could survive, it's iguanas.
They're herbivorous, and so if they're floating around on vegetation, they may even have a source of food to eat.
And with desert origins, these iguanas could have survived dehydration and the intense equatorial sun as they slowly drifted towards their new home.
That's Pacific Waves for today. For all episodes, head over to rnz.co.nz/Pacific. We're also on Spotify, Apple and iHeartRadio. From myself and the RNZ Pacific team, tō whā soifua.